Hey everyone, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be talking about the cerebrum, our four lobes that make up the cerebrum, and the surface of our cerebrum, what we call the cerebral cortex. So, several different structures that we're going to talk about today and some of the functions that they serve. You may recall in our last lecture we talked about subcortical structures. So, think about that word subcortical. Sub, that prefix means below. So, now we're talking about the stuff above it. The cortex and the cerebrum. So let's take a look at this image here. I've got a little brain, and if I break our brain apart and you take a look here, right, this green part is our cerebellum. We talked about that. And here's our brain stem. And so our brain stem, our cerebellum, that makes up our hind brain. And you can see this little bump in the brain stem. Those are our pons. And then this part is where we find most of our subcortical structures. And then right above it, this kind of dark, pink maroon color, that is our corpus callosum. Remember, the corpus callosum is what attaches our two hemispheres together. And if I break this apart and I pull out the subcortical structures, there we go. The result is this. And this is our cerebrum. Our cerebrum makes up our two hemispheres, and it can be divided into four separate lobes. And you can see the four lobes on your screen. The surface of our cerebrum is what we call the cerebral cortex. That word cortex translates to bark, like the bark on a tree. And we have all these different wrinkles and fissures in our cortex because it allows for more surface area. And I want you to think about that for a moment, because when we are looking at the cerebrum itself, we can kind of define it in two main ways. We have what's called white matter and gray matter. Gray matter is along the surface. You look at that picture on the right, you can see kind of that dark pink color. It's our gray matter. If I break my brain apart, you can see here the inside of our brain. I'll kind of show it up to the camera. That pink represents gray matter. It's the surface. And that's where we have a lot of somas, the cell body of a neuron. The thicker your gray matter, then you could make the argument the more neurons you have in your brain. And then the inner part, which is white, and you can see it on the picture on your screen there, what we call white matter, that's represented by all of the axons from these neurons. Remember, we talked about myelin sheath, and myelin kind of has a white tint to it. So the more white matter that you have on the kind of the inside of your brain, that means the more connections you have between the neurons. And this is important when we start talking about different diseases and things that impact either white matter or gray matter. For example, we're going to talk about a disorder pretty soon that talks about how it reduces our gray matter. Well, if it's reducing gray matter, that means it's thinning the surface of our brain, it's thinning the cortex, and it's literally eliminating neurons themselves. Whereas if we talk about something that impacts our white matter, we would say it's not necessarily that you have fewer neurons, it's that you have fewer neural connections, right? So before we kind of get into that specific information, let's first take a look at those four lobes. Again, the lobes that make up our cerebrum. We have our frontal lobe, which is obviously at the front, right? We have our temporal lobe, that's along the sides of our brain, and you can remember that we call these our temples. If you've got a headache, you might kind of massage your temples, right? So that's your temporal lobe along the side. Along kind of the top toward the back of our brain is called the parietal lobe. And then our smallest lobe is right there in the back, what we call our occipital lobe. And keep in mind that you have a frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe for each hemisphere. So you've got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere of your brain. So you have actually two frontal lobes. You've got your your left frontal lobe and your right frontal lobe. You've got your left occipital lobe and your right occipital lobe, etc. All right, so what do these do? Well, you can kind of see here. Let's skip frontal lobe for just a moment and let's look at the other three. Parietal lobes primarily help with our interpretation of touch. And so if you are holding an ice cube in your left hand, then you can tell that that is very cold because of your parietal lobe. And everything's lateralized. That'll be That'll be later in the lecture. And so if you're holding an ice cube in your left hand, you're going to tell it that's really cold from your right parietal lobe. If you touch something really hot with your right hand, then you can interpret that from your left parietal lobe. And so parietal lobe, the big function that you need to know for this class is it helps interpret primarily our sense of touch. Your occipital lobes, they're located in the back, right? Their primary function is to help interpret what we see. And so when visual information comes into your eyes, they travel down what are called optic nerves. As a reminder, they go to what's called the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to send that information to our occipital lobes. You can remember that there's a couple of C's in the word occipital. The occipital lobes, they help you see. And then your temporal lobes along the side, they're located right next to your ears. Well, kind of makes sense. Your temporal lobes, they help us interpret sound. And again, it's lateralized. So the reality is if some information is going in your right ear, then you are interpreting that in your left temporal lobe. So parietal, occipital, and temporal, they really help interpret our senses. And then my general kind of reminder or tip strategy for students is if you hear about anything else, there's a good chance that it's going to be the frontal lobe. Not always. There are a few exceptions to that rule, and we'll get to those exceptions a little later. But for the most part, if you are reading a question and it's asking which lobe is involved, if it's not talking about your senses, they're probably talking about your frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe does a ton of things. Your frontal lobe helps with things like critical thinking, planning ahead. It helps form our personality and allows us to have judgment. Your frontal lobe is kind of like the central executive of our brain, okay? Now, those are the lobes that make up, my brain just fell off the desk, oh my goodness. Your lobes make up your hemisphere. And as a reminder, the cortex is the surface. So if we look at the surface of these different parts of our lobes, then it tells us a little bit more information. And so, for example, let's go to this next slide here. Your occipital lobes are in the back. Well, if we're talking about the processing of information and the specific part of that cortex, we call that your visual cortex. So your visual cortex is the surface of your occipital lobe. Think the same thing with hearing, right? Your temporal lobe helps with interpreting sound. Well, the surface of your temporal lobe we call the auditory cortex. Think about your frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes help with all of these critical thinking elements, planning ahead. They allow for personality. They help with impulse control. That's your frontal lobes. Well, the surface of your frontal lobe we call your prefrontal cortex. Now, this is an oversimplification. The reality is there are certainly other functions that your lobes take care of, and there's other parts of your cortex that aren't, considered just the prefrontal cortex, but still cover the frontal lobe. For the sake of AP psychology, try to remember surface of the occipital lobe, visual cortex, surface of the temporal lobe, auditory cortex, surface of the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, which leaves us with one more lobe, right? The one on top there, the parietal lobe. This one gets a little more complicated. As we're talking about the parietal lobe, we're talking about your motor and sensory cortex. And it's kind of this band that goes along the top of the brain. Now, what does it do? The motor cortex is the part of your brain that is going to be sending out information about movement. Don't be confused. The motor cortex is not made up of motor neurons. Motor neurons are all over your arms and your legs, and they allow you to move around and dance around. The motor cortex is made up of interneurons, right? Interneurons make up our brain. So the motor cortex sends information to the motor neurons to move around. And you can see that some parts of our body require very specific movement, like our hands and our face require very specific movement. So there's more cortical space. And when I say cortical space, I just literally mean there's more space on the surface of your motor cortex dedicated to the parts of our body that need specific movements. Whereas your ankle, your knee, they don't need very specific movements, right? In fact, we kind of hope they really only move in one or two different ways. So those parts of our body don't require a lot of cortical space. There's not as much surface on the motor cortex dedicated to the parts of our body that have very generalized movement. And then located right behind our motor cortex is what's called our sensory cortex. And as a reminder, it's not sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are all over our body. Sensory neurons are in our hands and in our eyes and in our ears, right? The sensory neurons in our hand, if I touch something warm, will send a message up for interpretation and it'll go to the sensory cortex. But the sensory cortex is made up of interneurons. And just like the motor cortex, the sensory cortex has cortical space, the amount of space dedicated on the cortex, to different parts of the body that have higher or lower areas of sensitivity. So, for example, our lips are very, very sensitive. Our fingertips are very, very sensitive. And so they have more cortical space in the sensory cortex to interpret that. Whereas the back of our elbow, there's not a lot of sensory neurons there. And so the cortical space on your brain for the back of your elbow is very, very small. I hope that makes sense. We went pretty quick, and I forgot that we've got one more slide. So let's go ahead and talk about this last slide here. I'm going to blame Mr. Rees. He just walked in the room. All right, so we've talked about your visual cortex, your auditory cortex, your sensory cortex, your prefrontal cortex. What's left? Well, what's left is called the association areas. It's everything else. So look at this this graph at the bottom of the slide here, right? What is represented in pink is not the sensory cortex. It's not the motor cortex, the auditory, the visual. It's none of those things. It's what's left. That's the association areas. And this is the part of our brain that is dedicated to housing our memories, right? Who you are, where you're from, what you believe in, where you work, who your friends are. It's the association areas that allows us to pay attention in class. It's the association areas that allows us to understand language, to speak, right? To communicate with one another. And so if you look at this interesting graphic here, you'll notice that it is the association areas that makes up the biggest difference between humans and other species. Rats, cats, chimpanzees, it's important that they have motor and sensory areas because they need to interpret the senses. They need to be able to walk or crawl around. But as far as these in-depth, complicated memories, right, as far as their ability to communicate with one another, to pay attention and to problem solve, you can see that as a species becomes more complex, more space is dedicated on the surface of the brain for those functions. So humans have a significant amount of our brain. If we're looking at the ratio of the different areas of the surface of our brain, humans have a huge part of our brain dedicated to association areas. You compare that to something like a rat that's relatively small, right? What does a rat need to do? It needs to find food and not die, right? Humans are a little more complicated than that. All right. That should do it. It did. That was the last slide. Sorry about that little hiccup there. I hope that made sense. I went pretty quick. Best of luck, everyone. Email me with questions.